The night before I pulled the curtain off his whole act, I stood on the loading dock with a cigarette between two fingers and watched him eat the room like a man born to it. He laughed loud, shook hands like he loved every palm, told a story about a mission that sounded like a movie and a medal I knew didn't exist. I remember thinking then that the whole thing would end badly for him, and for some reason my hands were steady even as my heart wasn't, which meant something had already changed inside me. I will tell you how it got to that night, because if you only hear the end you will miss the quiet pieces that mattered, the small honest things that broke him. I am not the kind of man who tells stories unless they serve something. I show up, do the work, and leave. I work with my hands. For 7 years now I have been fixing things that cost other people thousands of dollars and giving them back, the thing you can put in the back of your truck and forget about until it breaks again. I am the guy who bends steel straight, who reads a wiring diagram like it is a map, who knows which bolt is going to shear on a cold morning. I keep my head down. I sleep hard, I wake up early and drink coffee that tastes like nothing and keeps me alive. My military past is a quiet file I keep in my chest. I carry it inside, not on my sleeve. You would not guess it looking at me in a fluorescent-lit shop smudged with grease, with a name tag that reads Chris and a pair of hands that look like they have been through storms. The shop has a different pulse when the boss walks in. He moves as if the room bends toward him, like gravity recognizes the suit instead of the man. He wears shoes that never touch dust, and he has a way of trimming silence with a story that fills the space like warm smoke. He sells things with bright eyes and a faster smile. People who don't know him leave feeling larger, like they just met someone who made them feel chosen. The people who work under him learn to smile at his stories because smiles are cheaper than truth. He is the kind of man who climbs ladders made of other people's trust and dresses the climb in medals he never earned. He tells stories about nights in far places, about a unit with letters people treat like holy words. He likes the words that sound dangerous, the acronyms that make dinner guests quiet. He mentions misfires and raids with the kind of detail that would fool anyone who only drinks their coffee with strangers. The problem is he says those things to impress clients so he can sign contracts worth months of wages. He says them to prove he is the sort of leader a company can trust to protect them from thieves, storms, and failure. He uses the stories to pin us where he wants us. Admiring, small, polite. There is a certain kind of rage that blooms slow in a veteran. It is not the loud television kind. It is a quiet, clinical heat that starts with the jaw and spreads to the hands until they twitch with memory. I have no patience for stolen valor. I saw a man like that once years back using bones in someone else's chest to build a throne. It made my stomach harden then and it tighten now. But I do not shout, I do not chase ghosts with a badge. I watch and I count the slips. A liar is a machine that always leaves a trail, and in the way he mixes his jargon you can see the faint oil stains of fiction. My life is built on facts. The trucks we fix, the clients we keep, the hours logged on paper so thin you can almost see through it at the end of the month. I like things that are true because truth is easier to sleep with. I saved a man once on a night where the wind had teeth and the map had given up. That is my truth and it sits in my chest like a weight I knew how to carry. I never told that story here, not to my coworkers, not to the cleaning lady who brings the mail. There is no glory in it for me. Glory is loud and cheap. I prefer the small currency of a job well done, of a client who calls back because the truck starts, of a new apprentice who learns to thread a wire without cutting his thumb. He meanwhile bathes in a different currency. His stories are designed to buy respect. He brags about small things like he invented them. He once claimed a seam in a rooftop saved a child's life and then used that story to win a charity gala table. He says the right names in the right order and people nod as if that ordering is prayer. He is not cruel in the outright way. He is cruel in the slow economy of theft, taking other men's histories and polishing them to sell like antiques. He intimidates in meetings not by volume, but by that careful selection of words, the way he layers a sentence so it sounds like a verdict. People who work with me think I am quiet because I am shy. They don't know I am quiet because I am watching. I learned to watch in places where watching meant survival. I learned to notice the small things that give a lie away. The way a man says a rank he never had, the way a true story carries certain scars that fabrication cannot fake. You can tell a fake story the way you can tell a fake smile. The difference is small and sharp if you have learned to look for it. I kept my head down because the work paid the bills, and because truth is a slow muscle that needs care. Sometimes I dreamed of a night where the whole thing would come clean, where a room full of people would realize they had been applauding a paper crown. I never imagined it would feel like this at first thought, like a current in my mouth. I did not know the exact way it would happen. I only knew I could not be part of a company built on a lie because lies rot the foundation of everything hard and honest I had built. So I listened, I recorded, I cataloged the stories he told, the clients he courted, the small inconsistencies that seemed like nothing until they were everything. The night I tell you about later did not come out of nowhere. It arrived because I had spent months holding the pieces that would make a whole. The two worlds I lived in were close enough to touch and far enough to hurt. I will tell you how they met. The conference room smelled like bad coffee and shipping labels. He stood at the head of the table like a man who had rehearsed a sermon and needed only the right crowd to glow. There were clients there in crisp jackets, a city councilman who wanted scaffolding contracts, our regulars from dispatch with grease under their nails, and a few newer hires who blinked at the big screens like they expected a movie trailer. He clicked the remote and a slide full of grainy photos flashed up behind him, a collage of dusty hills and a silhouette in profile. He began to tell a story the room was hungry for, a story with heat and danger and the sort of courage that makes people want to write checks. He told it slow, the way a man who never did the work tells a man he wants to be trusted. He described a convoy that hit an ambush, the monotone cadence of mortars and the smell of diesel turned to smoke. He painted an only-in-movies picture, a broken bridge, a collapsed Humvee, and him, of course, standing over a wounded man while the rain closed like a fist. The clients leaned in. The city councilman adjusted his tie. He talked about radio chatter like he had been translating Morse code, about orders he gave that saved lives, and about a heavy machine gun he had personally manned while the rest of his unit dragged people out. He stroked the word unit like it meant something they should all bow to. It was sculpted to sell contracts and to flatten any whisper of doubt beneath its weight. Then he got to the part where the instrument of his bravery should have lived. He smiled and said the name of the gun like it was a cathedral. A MK-48, he told the room, belt-fed, cooled for long engagements, a beast that chewed through 1,000 rounds and saved his team. He said it with a comfortable authority that made pens pause on paper. The slide behind him showed him, in a photo he had lifted from somewhere on the internet, leaning over what might be a heavy machine gun. The picture was all shadow and angle, and he had captioned it with his favorite line, the one he used to end every story and watch jaws fall open. My hands tightened on the pen I wasn't taking notes with. The name he used was wrong for the picture and wrong for the job. I had loaded that gun with my own hands in a place that tasted like metal and blood. I had wrestled ammunition belts into position as rockets threaded the sky. There is a certain feel to a belt, the give and the weight and the pause it makes when you pull it tight. The MK-48 doesn't have that same belly. The boss's words didn't match the way the belt sits on the feed tray. He said it fired 5.562, like someone who had glanced at a movie prop and stopped learning there. The MK-48 is a 7.62 weapon, and that mismatch rang against my teeth like a hollow note. I remember exactly how it sounded the first time my section leader said the name of that gun. It was cold and careful, and it came with diagrams you taped to plywood because the wind would tear the paper otherwise. You do not call a MK-48 a 5.56 gun. You do not tuck a 3-digit serial into a story unless you mean something. You do not, if you have ever slept on the hood of a truck waiting for dawn, invent the feel of a weapon you have never carried. His description of the recoil, the way he said he used it to pin the enemy down while we extracted the team, was a line I had heard in film and in used car sales rooms but never in a foxhole. It was the wrong vocabulary layered over the right cadence, and that wrongness is like a whisper to the ones who know. I didn't speak, I let the pitch of his voice do the work. People nodded. He added little details he thought would sell it, a failing sight that he had fixed with pen parts, a patch of heat that made an enemy visible. He finished with a laugh about how they called him the last man through, and the room clapped in the kind of way people clap when they are buying a myth. A client patted his shoulder. The councilman made a note. He was basking. He lit his lies like a pyre and watched people warm their hands at it. What he didn't know was that a lie of that particular technical sort is like leaving fingerprints at a scene. It narrowed the field. I was not the only one in the room who flinched when he named the gun wrong. There was a kid from shipping who kept glancing at his phone, and the old mechanic with one ear who had been out in a theater of operations for a brief hitch before he retired. They didn't say anything. Most people don't. Most people will not risk being the man who ruins a party. But for me, it was an incision on skin already raw. I felt something old and useful click into place, a plan as quiet and precise as a compass. After the meeting ended, the laughter rolled out into the parking lot and business cards were swapped like talismans. He stood under the street lamp and laughed with a client about bravery and medals he would never have to tidy. I walked to my truck jaw tight, and the story he told kept looping like a song with a bad chorus. That single misnamed weapon took the whole playbill and made it real. A man who could not tell the difference between bolted steel and bravado would sooner or later slip so far he could not fake his way back. I knew then with the slow, solid certainty of someone who has seen patterns before that the mistake was a gateway. I also knew what to do with gateways. I did not move fast then. I never move fast when the work must be done right. I began to collect, to ask, to listen. The misstep had opened the door. I only needed the right sequence to step through it. I called Marcus before I even drove out of the parking lot, because some things you can smell on a man from across a room and you do not ignore the smell. Marcus and I ran with the same small outfit once. He still answers at odd hours because he has kids and because part of him never stopped looking out for the rest of us. I told him the story as clean as the gravel under my boots, the wrong gun name, the picture that did not line up with what he described, the cadence of a man rehearsed but not lived. He laughed once, a short sound that carried both anger and pity, and said, "Send me everything you can." I sent him the slide from the presentation, the audio I had recorded on my phone, and the boss's LinkedIn page with the medals digitally pasted near his chest. I rang two more numbers that afternoon because truth has no patience for ego. Jenna, who used to work admin for a forward medical unit and now does verification at the county benefits office, promised to run a check through the records she had access to. Tommy, who retired early to a small desk job at the archives, said he would pull whatever rosters still had teeth from our old theater. They work slow when it is not important and quick when it is. Within hours, Marcus texted a short line, "Nothing." Jenna sent a PDF that was blunt and official sounding. The name the boss used did not appear in active rosters, archived rosters, or databases tied to veteran benefits. Tommy found no service number that matched the serial he bragged about. I felt the room inside me change, like something had clicked into place. They dug further because that is what we do. Marcus phoned a buddy still on a base who had access to a unit roster and got confirmation that the name of the unit the boss rattled off did not exist in the configuration he claimed during the years he claimed to be there. Jenna checked for participation in veteran-affiliated charities linked to the boss and found receipts. A small paper trail showing donations routed through a shell company registered under his wife's maiden name. It was the sort of paperwork people make when they want applause but not accountability. Tommy traced the photo behind the boss on the slide to a military surplus auction site where veterans sell old gear photos and fake props. The image had been lifted and cropped. The evidence stacked up the way broken things stack when you drop them. Every piece of proof landed on me like a small hammer. It is one thing to catch someone telling a fib and another to hold the documentation while they stand in a room full of people who trusted them. My anger was a cold, efficient thing. I had seen men take medals to bed and believe them like a lullaby. I had watched families donate to charities because some man in a suit had told a tidy lie about sacrifice. I thought about a widow at a company fundraiser who had reached out last year, looking for a contractor to fix a ramp for her son's therapy dog. The boss had promised personal attention and a discount because we stand by our own. The widow had written him a check. The thought of her gray-haired hands folding out cash for a lie made me careful about what I would do next. This was not about me making someone feel small. This was about righting a table built on rotten legs. So I formed a plan that looked like something you would carve with a pocket knife, small, precise, and hard to reverse. I would not shout. I would not assault him with claims before the world had a reason to listen. I would use the one instrument he relied on, the crowd, the stage, the performance, and turn it into the place where facts did their work. Marcus would be there in civilian clothes as a supposed client from a neighboring vendor. Jenna would be in the audience with a badge that looked official enough to keep him talking, and Tommy would bring printed statements from the archives and a chain of emails showing he had inquired about the Kingpin serial and found nothing. We arranged it like a military movement. Who would sit where, who would ask the right question, who would hand over what paper at what moment. I also used the small advantage I had earned over 7 years of fixing things and setting up events. I was on the crew scheduled to wire the hall, to check microphones and confirm the laptop that would play his slides. I told myself I was doing it for the company. The truth is I did it because the job allowed me to steer the room without appearing to steer it. I could place the people where they needed to be. I could make sure a microphone would be free at the exact moment we needed someone to ask a technical question no charlatan could answer without a lie. I printed the Jenna PDF and Tommy's archive note and slid them into a plain folder. I trained my face to be the same quiet thing I wore every morning. I slept poorly that night, but when dawn came, I felt like a man who has found the right tool for the job. There was another twist I did not expect. While Marcus and the others dug, they found a thread linking one of the boss's biggest municipal contracts to a small company that had oddly been listed under the boss's name in tax filings. The company sold safety vests with the boss's logo and donated some proceeds to the very charity the boss cited when he told his most dramatic tales. It smelled like a small, local con, a circle of favors and fake uniforms that fed off attention. That made the stakes larger, turned my plan from a moral correction into something that could stop a pattern of predatory behavior. I wanted him exposed not to revel in schadenfreude but to stop the taking. We had proof in hand and a stage booked. The rest would be geometry and timing. I felt the old muscle tighten in my chest, the same one that had kept me alive in worse places, and I knew exactly how to aim. The ballroom looked like a lie made pretty for the night. Chandeliers hung low like watchful eyes, white tablecloths pooled like small clouds, and the band played a slow song that sounded like a memory you couldn't place. Men wore rented tuxes the way they wore borrowed stories, slipping into shapes that made them feel larger. Women in silk leaned forward to hear what would be said. Cameras lined the back of the room like insects waiting for heat. The mayor sat 2 tables away, smiling as if he understood every line of the performance. I stood with a toolbox of cables and a clipboard and felt, for the first time in a long time, the pull of an old, precise excitement. The plan lived in my pocket like a folded map. He took the stage with a swagger that had been practiced in front of bathroom mirrors and bank mirrors and maybe a few mirrors with better lighting. The microphone caught his voice like a bottle snatches light, and the room tilted toward him. He wore a jacket with a small lapel pin I had only seen on veterans, that tiny fake gold shine that turns people polite. He began with the usual charm, thanking clients and staff and people whose last names meant nothing to me. He told jokes like a man building scaffolding for his next lie. People laughed because they wanted to believe. The clinking of glasses made a rhythm under his sentences, like applause already on the way. Then he told the story he must have saved for a night like this, the one that read like a script and smelled like iron. He said it in a place with a name he said slowly, flattering the word, and he spoke of a night that had changed him, of a team pinned down and of decisions made under a sky that had no mercy. He described the weather, the sling of a radio against a shoulder, the taste of cheap field coffee. The details were layered just enough to make you think you were seeing a film in your head. He ended that part with a small, humble bow and told the audience that the company's success was owed to the lessons he learned in the Special Forces, that those lessons were discipline, courage, and loyalty, and that he carried them into every contract, every handshake, every bid. The room stood up to applaud a man who had given them a moral anchor to hang their checks on. When he said Special Forces, it landed like thunder in me. The words meant things to men who have been taught to pull the parachute strings in silence. He used the name of a particular unit like it was a household name, and he did it with the kind of reverence that makes people stop smiling and start believing. He talked about calling patterns and stacking breaches and a phrase about squads east of the river that shouldn't have been used the way he used it. He wore the language like armor, and the armor wasn't heavy enough. My throat tightened, and for a second the box of tools in my hands felt useless. I watched him breathe and count his audience with the same calm eye I had used to count exits on a convoy. He was the sort of performer that made people forget to ask for proof. The twist he pulled out, the bit that made the room lean closer, was bringing someone else on stage. A woman in a faded uniform jacket he called a sister in arms, someone he said he had pulled from a buried ditch and saved her life. And she smiled with a small, fixed smile like someone who had been handed lines in a play. The crowd quieted down to listen to the two of them together. She spoke soft enough that a microphone swallowed part of her voice, and she thanked him for teaching her something, for filling a hole in her life. I felt the room close like a fist. I felt the widow I had thought about earlier tighten her fingers on her purse. The sight of them together was meant to be a seal on his performance, a real person to pin the story to. My allies sat where we'd planned, spaced like notes in a chord. Marcus was at a long table near the front, face calm in a dinner jacket that didn't make him look any thinner. Jenna had a press-like badge tucked into the neckline of her dress. She smiled faintly as if she knew a joke only she had heard. Tommy fiddled with an envelope that contained files we would need. They kept their faces small. That was the hardest part, watching a room of people fold around a lie and not letting the urge to shout ruin the architecture of the moment. We were playing a long game that needed patience like a surgeon needs a steady hand. I kept my hands on the soundboard because that was my cover and my tool. I could kill a mic or pass it on. I could make something sound like an echo and something else sound like truth. I tuned the levels like I was tuning a promise. The band had stopped, the city councilman had wiped his mouth with a napkin, and the boss leaned into the line about how he learned to lead under fire and how those lessons made him give the company a backbone. He looked at the crowd, and for a second I saw pure hunger in his eyes. The hunger of a man who had built his life out of other people's reverence and couldn't imagine living without it. A waiter moved through the room with a tray of wine, his steps matching the heartbeat in my ear. The boss lifted his glass and toasted bravery to those who serve, to those who sacrifice. The room clapped in a way that felt rehearsed and soft, as if everyone had agreed to play a part in his story. I felt two things in quick succession: the weight of what we were about to do and the neatness of the moment that would let us do it. The stage was set in every sense. All that remained was the precise question, the small technical detail that a real special forces man would never get wrong, and the microphone that would make his silence louder than any shout. When he finished and opened the floor for questions, the room hummed like a hive with too many bees. People raised hands because ritual said you raise a hand. Cameras clicked because cameras always click. He smiled like a man warming himself at a bonfire he built. I sat for a beat, feeling the old, slow patience settle over my shoulders the way a coat sits right after you pull it on. I had never stood up at one of these dinners. I'd fixed the lights, tightened the mic stands, and left the stories to other men. Tonight I stood because tonight the story mattered more than the tab of polite silence. I walked up like I was walking to check a fuse, not to start a war. I tapped the mic and it caught my voice clean the way a truth should. I thanked him for his service out loud in a tone that sounded like an offer and a challenge at the same time. He smiled the smile of a man who expects thanks to feed him. Then I asked the first question, and it was the kind you ask when you want a lie to do the heavy lifting for you. I said, I was curious about the MK-48 you mentioned in your talk. You called it a 5.56 belt fed, when every training note I remember marked it as a 7.62. When you were talking about feed tray alignment and heat sinking the barrel, could you explain how you adjusted the gas plug for 5.56 rounds in that model specifically? The room tightened. He blinked like we had put a bright light in his face. He laughed, a little forced, and said something about misnaming equipment in the fog of memory. He gave an answer that sounded like improvisation, pretty words with no anchor. I followed with another question, quiet and clinical. You mentioned stacking breaches in a pattern used by your unit. Which stacking pattern did you use, column or wedge, and how did you alter it for a compound with two-story concrete and limited sight lines? A real man who lived in that pattern would speak in specifics. A liar uses verbs and anecdotes. His answer was air. He said we adapted, we improvised, we led from experience. I watched the way his hands fumbled for a tempo they had never learned. I asked the third question, the one that would have felt like a knife in a pocket if the melody was wrong. You named a service number in your story on LinkedIn once. Will you affirm that number and the unit deployment date so we can properly document your service for the charity ledger? The people at the tables shifted. I kept my voice flat because flat is harder to punch than high. He tried to pivot to make it about feelings or loyalty, to push the audience to his side with rhetoric. He said that paperwork and numbers were secondary to sacrifice, that we should not drown him in bureaucracy. That was when Jenna stood up from her table and walked to the stage. She had a folder, and when she opened it, she didn't show a paper that said the man was a hero. She showed a printout with one line and a government header and an empty result. She said into the mic, in a voice practiced to read facts, that official records show no military service for the name he used, and that attempts to match his claimed serial and deployment returned no hits. The room made a sound like a soft collective intake. He laughed again, but it was shorter now. Marcus rose before I could think and said quietly from the back that he had contacted a roster on a base and had confirmation that the unit he named had different designations during the years he claimed to be there. He did not shout. He spoke as a witness. Tommy handed a sheaf of printed emails to the organizer seated near the head table, emails that showed an agent had been retained by the company to place images and create narratives for marketing. The organizer's face turned pale as the paper hit her lap. Then I did what I had rehearsed alone in the van while we set up lights. I handed the sound technician a small flash drive and asked for the clip we had recorded months earlier when he was practicing his talk into a phone in the company kitchen. The clip played through the hall, and at first it was the voice you all knew him, then the words that followed made the room tilt. On the recording, he was coaching a woman on how to say sister in arms and laughing about how it will play at the gala. He joked about hiring someone from an agency to stand in as a veteran for the photo op. His voice was casual, the voice of a man who had arranged a story like a set designer arranges furniture. The woman on stage, who had just thanked him, stood very still. The jacket slipped off her shoulders like a curtain falling. She said in a voice that did not want the suit she was wearing that she had been paid to play a part, and she apologized to everyone. There was a hush so profound you could hear the chandelier breathe. The mayor, who had been smiling for the camera, looked as if someone had slammed a door in his face. The clients at the nearest table murmured and wanted their checks back like men who suddenly found they had purchased an illusion. He tried then to lob an emotional grenade, to claim people were attacking his character. He started to say he'd been through hardship and maybe the records were wrong, maybe the system had failed him, and for a second some in the room softened. But Marcus, Jenna, and I had put a second piece into motion. Marcus produced the invoice trail that linked the safety vest company to donations funneling into a private account tied to the boss's name. Jenna showed a scanned check to the widow I had thought of before, A check that never reached the charity's bank because it had been converted into credit at a company-run storefront. It was small fraud, not war crimes, but it was theft from trust, and the room smelled it like a fire. Security moved in with polite steps, not violent ones, and the boss's swagger was gone. He opened his mouth and closed it like a man realizing his script had been lost. He tried to slither out the back door toward the valet, but a city official stood and asked for an explanation for his contracts. Cameras pushed forward. Someone started to live stream. The band started playing, badly and fast, like an alarm. I sat down then because the work had been done. My heart felt both hollow and honest. The applause came, but it was thin and uncertain, not the thunder he had been used to. I did not yell, I did not gloat. I packed my tools slowly and walked to the exit with the same steady steps I had used on far worse nights. The lights felt different leaving the room, not because they were brighter, but because the air around them had been cleared. People whispered and pointed. Men who had been buying his charisma looked smaller. The justice we had served was quiet and public, like a verdict read in daylight. I kept my head down, but inside a part of me breathed out at last. The lie had been exposed the way a rotten beam is when you shine a light through it. The rest would be for the city, for lawyers, for men with badges. All I had wanted was for truth to be heard where it had been bought. Tonight it had been. The room had changed from before. It felt smaller and louder at once, like everyone had moved closer to hear the same quiet thing. I had the mic again because someone had handed it back to me like a tool you trust, and the boss stood with a face warming into sweat, a man whose costume was falling apart in the light. I breathed slow and began to ask questions the way you thread a wire through a lock. You go slowly until the mechanism must show you what it is. My first question was soft and plain. When you said you called for fire, what grid system did you use, MGRS or latitude-longitude, and how many digits did you give? It looked like a small detail, but in those worlds a detail is a doorway. He blinked like a fish. He tried the old trick of smiling and turning it into a story about chaos, about fog and the wrong radio and how the signal was bad that night. He said the words grid and call for fire with an actor's confidence. The crowd shifted. Some people nodded because they wanted to believe the narrative of heroism more than they wanted to know the truth. I asked the follow-up because liars trip over small things. If it was MGRS, did you use a 6-digit or 8-digit grid for a bracketing call, and what adjustments did you pass when the battery of artillery was on the second shift? He started to stammer. He said something about we made it work and laughed too loudly. Real soldiers live in numbers. Real soldiers' mouths do not make those empty sounds when asked for precision. I moved now to language only insiders use. I asked about the weapon he named and the crew drill he described. When your gunner overtempers the barrel on a belt fed at sustained rate of fire, what immediate remedial action do you take to prevent a cook-off, and how did you modify your rates of fire when the ambient temperature was above 40 degrees Celsius? He swallowed and tried to say we'd rotate barrels like a line from a training montage. The man on stage could not name the specific stopgap we had used, could not explain the feed tray shim we slipped in place when rounds started to crumple. The way his sentences skated over facts told me what I already knew. He had read, not done. Then I asked something that was awkwardly intimate, the kind of question that presses on memory like a finger on a bruise. What was your call sign on that deployment and who held Radio Stack 2 in your team? Call signs live a long time. You inherit them, you lose them, they are our gossip and our honor. He gave me a name that had the wrong cadence, a name that was more sitcom than Sentinel. People in the room started to recognize the pattern in his voice. He made things up the way a gambler makes bets. Marcus quietly mouthed a correction at his table. He had heard the boss say a different name in private, one that didn't match the timeline at all. Contradiction is the start of a collapse. I began to use nonverbal tests because some lies fail when you remove language from the stage. I asked him to demonstrate the hand signal his team used to indicate a breach cleared and free for movement. The old rules say you cannot fake that ease. He blinked and made a vague motion like a man waving a fly away. The old mechanic with one ear in the third row stood and without ceremony made the correct signal with his hands, a clean motion I could read in my bones because I had used it in dust and rain. You could see the heat leave the boss's face as if someone had turned down the lights. His hands had never learned the grammar of the field. People began to murmur and cameras got closer because live video sees a stammer like a lie tells on itself. He tried now to grab the stage with a story about a medal, the one he wore on his lapel, and I asked him what campaign ribbon it represented and which regulation it corresponded to, because medals are catalogued like fossils and a fraud swaps them poorly. He misnamed the color pattern, pointed to a sequence that did not exist, and for the first time he looked small, like a boy left in a suit too big for him. A retired sergeant in the audience corrected him quietly and explained how ribbons align versus how the boss had arranged his. A woman near the front, whose father had died in a real deployment, made a sound that was not a noise so much as a release. He started to contradict himself more openly. One minute he said he was on alert in year X, the next his LinkedIn showed him at a conference in the same month signing a contract here in town. He claimed his unit designation and then used an acronym that did not exist for that branch in that era. When I asked about logistics, specifically which supply point handled your unit's resupply and what serials the manifests used, the applause behind him thinned and the room smelled like a man being unmasked. He tried to accuse us of attacking his character and yelling about heart and sacrifice, but the questions had already done their work. Each simple, specific question was a tooth. Put together, they ground him down until his answers were not answers at all but thin noise. I did not shout him down. I asked steady and precise until his texture showed through and everyone could see it. Watching him flail in the small spaces where truth lives felt strange and old, like watching a machine you used to know become useless. He was sweating under his jacket and his voice kept tripping over its lines. People who had signed checks under his stories traded looks and the mayor's smile had gone hard. When I finished, the room sat in a kind of stunned silence. The truth had not been loud. It had been a pattern of small doors opening one by one, and he could no longer stand in the center of them as if he were the architect. When the questions kept coming, the air in the room changed from polite warmth to the cold that arrives before a storm. People stopped pretending they were at a celebration and started watching like witnesses at a trial. My questions were small and steady, like a surgeon's incisions, and each answer he gave pulled another thread until the whole thing began to unravel. He tried to smile through it at first, the thin smile of a man who thinks charm can paper over anything, but his smile kept breaking at the corners. You could see the sweat gather along his hairline, and the paint thinned on the mask he had been wearing for so long. The clients started to murmur, low and immediate, faces folding like maps. A construction foreman I knew leaned forward, wiping his palms on his suit, and asked quietly to see the contracts he had praised so highly on stage. A woman from the nonprofit table stood and said that her charity had received a promised donation that never arrived, that she had been sent an email with a photo and a thank you note while the account showed no deposit. People who had once applauded began to trade looks, and I saw the moment they recalculated what trust meant in business. The mayor shifted in his seat as if the skin of the gala had suddenly become very thin, and his aides leaned in, scrolling through their feeds like men trying to catch a falling object. He tried to regain control by talking about rank and structure as if repeating words could rebuild him. He said he had led teams and rattled ranks with a confidence that sounded like a rehearsal for a speech, not like someone describing a family. I asked him to clarify his own chain of command during the deployment he referenced, to name the officer who signed off on his awards, to place a specific captain in a battalion on a certain date. His eyes darted and he started to contradict himself, saying 1 month then another, naming a lieutenant who, as Marcus and Tommy both pointed out quietly to me, had been stationed across the globe that same year. An old sergeant near the head table muttered the correct structure under his breath, not out of cruelty but from a lifetime of remembering things correctly. When you are used to details because they are how people survive, you can smell a lie the way someone else smells smoke. His words came faster and thinner, like a fabric wearing through. He tried to throw the conversation into the realm of feeling, to tell us how sacrifice meant more than paperwork, and he started to cry on cue like an actor reaching his cue. The woman he had put on stage, the one who had been paid to play hurt, covered her face and did not cry with him. There was no echo of shared history in their embrace, only a manufactured rhythm. Then a live stream from the back of the room picked up a notification on his phone that he could not hide. A voicemail he had recorded to a marketing consultant where he laughed about how easy it is to buy a uniform and a sob story and talked about the angle that opens wallets. The ringtone cut across the hush like a warning bell. Someone in the crowd had already uploaded it. He went from words to excuses to conspiracies in the space of a long breath. He pointed a trembling finger at me once, saying, "Why would I do this?" suggesting I had been jealous or had some vendetta. That was the moment the room tightened the way a wound does when someone touches it. I said nothing about motives or old ghosts. I let the public record do the talking. Tommy had already slid a thin file across a table toward the head organizer. It contained bills of sale for medals, a credit card trail to a reenactor's supply store, and emails where he had hired a photographer to create old-looking photos. Jenna had a notarized statement from the charity that detailed deposit dates and a lack of funds. Marcus had a voice memo from a base exchange clerk saying the unit he named had no record of him. The documents did more than accuse him. They explained how he lived from fabrication. Security started to circle politely, the way people do when they want trouble contained without spectacle. He tried to laugh them off and then to bargain, offering free installation at a school or discounted scaffolding for city projects in exchange for mercy. That is when one of his clients, a small business owner who had been moved to tears by the boss's stories and had signed a contract that committed thousands, stood up and demanded an immediate audit of work already done. The man slammed a single hand on the table, not loud but hard enough to stop a heartbeat. The room reacted like a struck bell. Men began to request refunds, and a camera phone in the second row already had the mayor asking his chief of staff for a halt to any new contracts pending investigation. The boss began to stammer over rank structure, and when I asked him to name the insignia sequence between a staff sergeant and a first sergeant, he could not do it. He guessed, he flailed, and then he was silent. The silence was not the dignified kind, it was a vacuum of answers where bravado used to live. It was humiliating in the way a mask falls off a face and you see the real shape under it. I watched him look for allies and find none. The applause that greeted him earlier in the night turned into a scatter of polite claps. Not the kind that fills a chest, but the kind that closes a door. He tried once to bolt to use the confusion as cover, but the valet had been warned and a city official had already stood at the exit. Cameras leaned forward. The live stream had exploded and strangers were calling out details from my questions. He stopped with his hand on the handle and stood there like a man weighing a last story against the reality of 100 small facts. He chose to stay and face it, or perhaps he had no choice. Either way, the facade was gone. The man who had fed on other people's sacrifice stood alone in a room that had turned away from him, and for the first time his shadow did not reach anyone willing to follow. The morning after, the shop felt different even before I turned the key in the door. News alerts had already started to crawl across phones like ants. Someone at the company had emailed the staff a short note saying the boss was on administrative leave pending an investigation, and by mid-morning HR had a packet on every desk outlining steps for an audit. Clients called asking for explanations. The mayor's office withdrew the ribbon cutting until the contracts were reviewed. The live stream from the previous night had been clipped and shared across feeds, and people were not kind in the comments. I watched it all with my coffee gone cold because there was a weight lifting that felt like answering to something older than paychecks. By noon, the owner asked to see me in his office, and I thought for a second he might be angry at the chaos. He closed the door, poured himself coffee without offering me any, and then he sat down like a man who had just learned he had been sleeping on rotten wood. He didn't make a speech. He said he had suspected for a while some invoices never tallied, a vague story about supply chain provenance that didn't add up, but he had never had the proof. Then he said thank you in a way that felt like an apology to all the small, honest things the company had stood for. He slid a slim stack of internal memos across his desk showing HR found forged service records, receipts from an atelier selling fake insignia, and transfer records leading to the shell company that marketed safety vests and staged veterans for photos. There were twists the night had not shown. The woman he put on stage had gone to the press carrying a signed statement saying she was paid to be an extra, but she also gave them a file that showed the boss had coached her on dates and names. The photographer confessed on a live stream to staging images for marketing authenticity, and that confession was the kind of opening that made people in procurement go look through old invoices. The widow who had been promised a ramp received a full restitution wire from the owner's personal account before noon, and someone had anonymously called her to say the ramp would be built on the house this weekend at no charge. I found myself on that job Saturday, smoothing metal and thinking about how small kindnesses matter more than the headlines. The company moved fast. HR terminated him for violating the code of conduct and for falsifying documents. The owners alerted the contracts office, and a procurement audit froze any new municipal work tied to his signatures. A civil investigator arrived the next day with a stack of subpoenas and a calm that was not theatrical. The man who had loved to make a room feel small and full of him was escorted out with his framed commendations, left on the reception desk like props no one wanted to touch. He filed for an injunction that night through some lawyer he found online, and the law clerks had a fine time sorting out his claims versus public record. His name trended in the kind of way that ruins futures but rarely teaches lessons. Some people wanted me to take credit, to stand in the foyer and let cameras catch my jaw and my hands. I did not want that. The owner squeezed my shoulder in his office like a man who had just been given back something that shouldn't have been sold. He offered me a raise, a title, even a seat at the contract review board. I thought about it like I think of everything major, slowly and by how it will affect other people. I asked him to make the widow whole first, to redirect 10% of potential recoveries to a community fund for repairs and ramps and rides for veterans who could not get around easily. He agreed without blinking. He also asked if I would be willing to help vet future hires, to have a quiet word in HR now and then. I said yes, because some parts of a system that work should be kept honest by men who know how to tell. There was fallout that made the work feel real. A few clients canceled contracts and asked for refunds. One councilman resigned from a charity board after admitting he hadn't checked records deeply enough. A local journalist dug into the shell company and found other small scams feeding the same vanity machine. The story grew legs, and the press asked for interviews that my hands were not meant for. The woman who'd played the veteran went public with a longer statement about how easy it was to get paid to play someone you weren't, and she volunteered to testify. The marketing consultant the boss had used took a plea. The consultant's account showed invoices for actors, props, and wardrobe that matched items pulled out of the boss's locker at the office. People messaged me afterward, some veterans saying thank you, others asking why I had waited. My answer was the one I always come back to: I didn't want to punish a man as much as I wanted to stop the taking. That meant building a case where the truth could do the work. I never called him a liar on stage. I asked questions and let silence collect the answers he couldn't give. The owner said later that watching the boardroom video was like seeing a structural failure happen in slow motion. You could see where beams had been replaced by painted cardboard. You could not unsee it once the light hit. A week later, the company organized a small event to say they would refund, rebuild, and reset. I went, walked through, signed the paperwork, shook a few hands, and left when the speeches started. My life went back to being the steady dirt under a truck and the way the wrench fits the bolt. I fixed the widow's ramp myself on a rainy Saturday and ate a sandwich while she cried and called it a blessing. That felt like enough. I had given him the rope by sitting the room up and letting the questions do their work, and the man had hanged himself with it in front of everyone he'd used. The justice was not loud or glorious. It was paperwork and returns and a widow's porch that didn't wobble anymore. That was the kind of ending I wanted.